The problem of nature as standard. Today we face an unprecedented moral crisis. Why is it unprecedented? In the past we've had moral crises. Today, crisis is governed, administrated even, fueled by an overarching machine. We have a phenomenon called chaos management, which involves the establishment of crisis as a new norm, as a new orthodoxy. If it's not critical, if it's not shocking, then it's not really relevant. It doesn't fit. It doesn't go along with the flow, which is that of crisis. And crisis requires the administration by the machine. Everything has to go through the machine. Whatever doesn't go through the machine is dangerous. Right? It is a kind of virus. It is an alterity that is somewhat of a residue from the past. It has to be integrated, digitized, and ultimately encapsulated within our new digital world, governed by the machine. The machine is not just a kind of tangible entity. It is also and primarily it's logic, the logic of the machine. Now, this uniforming, overarching structure, the logic of the machine, and of course its, we could say its tangible manifestations, right? It's the mechanisms, yes, that that we are given to use and to to filter our experience, yes, our everyday life experience. Well, all of this would have been considered in earlier ages tyrannical. Right? The notion that a uniform standard of right and wrong could be applied universally was considered tyrannical. So, for instance, in the Mencius, the Mengzi, the ancient Chinese text, we find someone asking about this possibility of establishing a universal standard, and the philosopher answers that that would be equivalent to applying one pair of shoes, one size, to everyone, to everyone's feet. That just would not work. It would be against nature. And so we have the ancients always appealing to nature. Of course, we do too, to some extent, but we do so by confirming, validating the necessity of our machine. For nature, as we conceive it in the modern world, is a mechanistic chaos, a vortex of sorts, that can be translated in the machine the machine of human society, of the modern regime. So the vortex somehow requires the intervention of our machine. It calls for, if only tacitly, implicitly, it calls for our dedication to the consolidation of this overarching machine that allows us to coexist. Of course, we don't have peace, but that's not the problem. The important thing here is to manage war. It is a machine of war management and war fueling, war mongering, perhaps even, yes, that we attend to, that we are to devote ourselves to. We go to school, and of course we participate in the learning about this machine, its logic, its necessity, given the evolutionary forces that led to its consolidation. And so the problem of nature as standard in itself is out of the window, necessarily. It's extremely difficult for us to conceive of it in meaningful ways, given the way we are raised within the machine. But again, the ancients would consider this appeal to the machine as tyrannical. And this brings up an important question. I mean, what were the ancients really about? What did they stand for? And what was really going on in the ancient world? So here we can explore a bit what happened and what eventually led to the establishment of our technological Leviathan. In early antiquity, things were set up so that you would have, characteristically, a mingling of gods and men, and of course heroes who served as mediators between the human and the divine. The world of gods, heroes, and men was the world of nations, of cities. So this, of course, throughout the world, right? We see this if we look at various societies, various areas, geographical areas. We see this phenomenon, right? This is the pagan world, right? And of course, various peoples, right, had various gods, or at any rate, various names for gods and for heroes. Now, this disparity of names and sometimes of habits, given the peculiarities of certain regions, right, inspired certain people who call themselves something, who were called, at any rate, at some point, philosophers, to envision a world that is beyond, right, the one that we are raised in, the ones in which gods, men, heroes all somehow live together. And this other world would be called, among the Greeks, clearly, physis, or nature. Now, originally, nature was a term that pertained to the world or the order of things that involved gods, heroes, and men. So everyone, everything had its own nature or its way of being, right? So we have the nature of the gods, the nature natura deorum, as Cicero would put it. We have the nature of women, the nature of men, the nature of dogs. Of course, the nature of the human being, the way of the human being. How does the chicken behave? How does it live? What is the point of it? How does the bee, right, live? What is the way of the bee? And you have various, we could say, poetic formulations to describe the nature of the bee. In other languages, we have the same issue, right? In Chinese, we will have the Tao, and in Sanskrit, the Dharma. What is significant here to point out is that this notion of the way is always tied to speech, because the way of the chicken is the way also we speak about the chicken. And so, for instance, Tao in ancient Chinese means at once the way of whatever being and speech, or logos, in fact. So in Greek, physis and logos are very much overlapping as terms. Now, with the coming of philosophers, we have the sense that this world that every nation has is a kind of dream. At any rate, it has its foundation. And this foundation must be common to all peoples. So nature here is no longer an aspect of all beings, primarily, or merely. It is something that is beyond, beyond the semblance of things. Things seem to be in a certain way. It's a kind of mirage that we live in. And in order to transcend this mirage, we have to go back to the nature of all of those natures, right? The nature, the root, the foundation of the various ways. Why is it that the monkey behaves in a certain way and the chicken behaves in another, and the bee and the human being and so forth? There must be a foundation to this, right? And where do the gods come from? Why, where do the people come from? Well, you could say they come from the gods, but where do the gods come from? So there must be a foundation of nature. And so the philosopher turns in a new way to this foundation. In what sense is this new? Well, in the respect that he is no longer perceiving nature as something that is, readily available. He is rather contemplating. Right? The activity in Greek is named theorein, contemplation. He is turning, as it were, away from the stream of sensory perception to its ground. So he's, in some way, we could say that he's dreaming of a foundation to the dream. Right. And in doing so, he envisages something permanent, whereas everything within the world of men and gods and heroes is somewhat impermanent. I mean, the gods, of course, last longer, but ultimately they're not really eternal. They're immortal, but they're subject to a fatality. They are tied to the world that men partake in. And if there were no men, then there could not be any gods or heroes, in the respect that the world would not be the same. The order would be broken, the order of things. And so the dream would be dispelled. Now, for the early philosophers, it becomes necessary at this point to even, not only desirable, but necessary to consider what is grounding this theater of a world. And so they go back contemplatively, not in a sensory manner, but they try at any rate to envisage, to have a vision, and thus a kind of dream, a vision of what is underlying all of our today we could even say our worldviews, but the point is our lives, not just a perception of our lives, but our lives as a whole. So this is not a question of really of points of view, right? These people have this kind of point of view, and others have another point of view. No, it's their entire life, right? Their life world, their living experience, the way they live. Yes, not a subjective point of view. This should be clear. So, what about this world of experience, of ordinary experience that we're meshed in, right? Well, it's a kind of dream, and so the philosopher tries to go back to its foundation, right? Its foundation is permanent, and it has an advantage. It allows for stability of mores, right? If we turn to this world of permanence, we transcend somehow the strife, right? The battlefield of ordinary life. However, it has a disadvantage, which is to say that it tends to alienate us from the impermanent. So now we have a major problem. How do we relate the permanent to the impermanent? And in comes Socrates, or if you like, even Siddhartha, and various other characters throughout various stories and peoples. We see this. At any rate, Socrates' paradigm helpful paradigm for us, provides a template for a possibility, which is to say that the permanent, so the other world, the world beyond semblance, beyond the illusory, beyond the pretense, right, at this point, is now sought back within the world of gods, men, and heroes. This is somewhat of a spectacular response to early philosophy, what we usually call pre-Socratic philosophy. Why? Because, as Cicero points out, Socrates is drawing the ideas, the eternal forms of the early philosophers, back into the city. Now, in the city, we know that originally physis, nature, was the ways of things. So it belonged to things. And so Socrates, in effect, is doing this. He's saying, well, the cause, the ground of this dream world, I'm bringing back within the city, and I'm showing that it is essential as a fundamental property of everything, sensory entities as well, of course, as well. I mean, you don't simply have the idea of justice, you have the idea of this dog, right? So all contents of experience are grounded, every content of experience is grounded in a permanent form, has its permanent form. Of course, from here we will have Aristotle who will elaborate and re-articulate this problem, speaking of species and so forth. But the point is that what we have is still an appeal to nature, but nature now is a kind of standard that is at once a guide. So nature is at work within the ways of, well, all beings, right? Of all things, of every determination within the realm of experience. So nature is not simply a standard that is calling us out of the world, but it is a standard that is guiding us to transcend the limitations of this world. Nature is not only, again, a standard, but also a guide, a providential presence within everything. This is essential to understanding, for instance, the rise of Christianity. Of course, with Socrates, what you have is an attempt to purge our ordinary life so that we may regain access to its principle, its guiding natural principle. Right? A corrective principle that is, in fact, discovered ultimately at work in our very purging. It calls us to purge ourselves. Purge ourselves of what? Well, of the illusory, of pretense. It turns out that people, kings, believe to be kings just because they were called kings. Well, no. Socrates says, no, you're not a real king. And that applies for everyone, right? All categories. The painter, who is the real painter? Who is a true painter? Who is a true anything? And it turns out that it is not the name, it is not the appearance either, that defines really what you are. It is something else that, it is the ground of the name, in fact, that defines what you are. And of course, whether you're right or wrong. Right? So the question of natural right comes up. Right? Of course, in our societies, we have by and large rejected that notion, unless we say that, well, we recycle it and we redefine it, right, in terms of power of evolutionary forces that are somehow, again, driving us toward the machine. But now, in the classical world, we have the human being, paradigmatically, most notably, who presupposes a kind of telos, or perfection. Everything is has its own telos, its own way, its own end, right? And this end is somehow hidden, right? It is something that, it is true, the philosopher, right, can envision, but aside from envisioning this nature as a standard, we can also be exposed to its presence as an activity, a providential activity, by purging our vision. What is the crucial distinction between a Platonic idea and the objects of the senses? Well, the objects of the senses, of course, are carrying a huge load of darkness. They're opaque, whereas the ideas are things that are transparent to the understanding. So they're forms of the understanding, whereas the sensory object is a form of non-understanding. We need to open that form up, purge it of obscurity, of darkness, and recover what is original to it. So the pure form of the table, even the pure form of the apple, the pure form of all of the contents of experience, and of course, pure form of justice, of right and wrong. A return to the world of ideas, not as simply transcendent, although it is clearly transcendent. It constitutes a kind of standard, and in that respect, we will also have a tradition of natural law, right, that represents this nature as standard. But most importantly, nature as guide. Right? And this is where we come to Cicero. Cicero speaks of natura optima dux, perfect guide. You don't need even the city's laws, for that matter, and certainly if you do need them, you don't need them, as they're not the primary guide for your life. The proper guide of man is nature, right? But where is this nature? Let us recall once again that Socrates has brought nature, as it were, back into the city. So we're going back to the ancient notion of everything having its nature, but now the nature is understood as a philosophical problem. A properly philosophical problem means that it is a problem for reflection. We don't take it for granted. Whereas in pre-philosophical terms, the way of the dog, it's a common sense issue, right? We imagine it. It's readily accessible for the imagination. But the imagination becomes a great problem with philosophy. And so the imagination is fine. We need the imagination. But it now is exercising the element of reflection. And this, of course, affects the various arts, everything we do in life. We no longer go to war because we have to fulfill a role, a social role within the order of things. We fight primarily in the context of a philosophical purgation, which is a reflective purgation through reflection. Through reflection, the compulsions of life, so the way things are just because they're part of an order that is predetermined, are exposed to themselves, to their core, their source, right? To their principle of constitution, beyond social expectations, right? Beyond the grasping of the imagination. So, yes, the early philosophers were right. The order of the polis, of the city, is not ultimate. It is a kind of dream. But when they sought the way out, when they sought transcendence, they alienated themselves from this ordinary dream to end up in another parallel dream. So Socrates' job here is to retrace the new dream back into the old one. And when these two somehow clash, when they come, or when they, at any rate, when they're reconciled, what we have is a disclosure. A disclosure, a kind of openness, yes, a fundamental openness of man to not another dream, but an agency that is at work. This agency is ultimately what nature is about. Not nature as the creator of dreams, or Mara, the goddess of the Sanskrit tradition, not a kind of malevolent spinner of irrational fate, but a mind that calls us to transcend the illusory, right? And so that redefines this whole theater of life in terms of a platform for our ascent to the mind. Naturam optimam ducem, tanquam Deum, sequimur, et paremus. Cicero speaks to us of the wise. The wise speak thus: we follow and we obey. We follow and we obey nature, perfect guide, as a god. We follow as a guide, we obey as a standard. The only way out of our current crisis, the only way out that we are given, the only way out of the machine, involves a return to a divine nature that is at once standard and guide in our everyday life.